Okay, and welcome to this quick video. It's going to be partly on chapter 54 of the eText on civil rights. So I'm going to push out some more information to you shortly. I'll finish the Prezi and post it on Edmodo and the Wakelet later today. But I wanted to get some of this out to you before, because I know some of you are working on notes. Some of you may hear tapping. That's the stylus on the iPad as I'm recording this in TouchCast. The sound will be a little wonky. I'm not using a microphone. I'm just going right off the iPad, so please bear with me. So the chapter... Oh my goodness. I just realized that chapter 54, section 8 did not save on the Prezi whenever I set it up. So we're going to insert that now in this quick video review. And it's also updated on the Prezi. So chapter 54, section A, we're going to drop this into the video. And as I stated previously, let me go back to the VApp part here. This deals with Mr. Pasquale's class review. Plessy versus Ferguson, where separate but equal was allowed. The Jim Crow laws come into place. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, is formed in the early 1900s. Then we have the Harlem Renaissance and the Progressive Era come forward in the 19-teens into the early 1920s. Then from the World War II Prezi that I gave you guys in class, 1943, talks about the racial tensions that are breaking out. Yesterday was Jackie Robinson Day. He is the first African-American to play in Major League Baseball. You had the Negro Leagues going on, and many of the players in the Negro Leagues were just as good, if not better, than many of the players in Major League Baseball. But they were segregated. Jackie Robinson was the first African-American to play in the big leagues in Major League Baseball. Controversial. Pittsburgh had two excellent teams, the Homestead Grays and the Pittsburgh Crawfords in the Negro Leagues, and they had some baseball players who were phenomenal in those leagues. That was in the 1940s. Then it takes us to Brown versus Board of Education. It's discussed in 1954. Two key players in that, the NAACP's main attorney was Thurgood Marshall. He was the lead attorney arguing that separate but equal was not fair because even though they're separate, they're far from equal in quality of schools. And Earl Warren was the Supreme Court Justice, former governor of California. He was rather progressive. He was the Chief Justice and in charge of the court during the hearing of Brown versus Board of Education. And this turned segregation on its ear. But as you'll see later in the Prezi and the video, segregation was still resisted and many other efforts had to come in. Chapter 54, section B gets into the details. We had the Rosa Parks myth versus fact. I'll pull this up. There's the link to the history. If you Google Rosa Parks and then history.com, it'll give you that link. And it tells you 10 things you may not have known about Rosa Parks. And it gets into the fact that she was not the first woman to be arrested for not giving up her seat on the bus. She wasn't necessarily tired from that day. She was just tired of giving up her seat. And there's a large mythology around that. Some good, some bad. That incident of her getting arrested led to the Montgomery bus boycott. And that was set up by the Montgomery Improvement Association. A little-known Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the organizers of the Montgomery Improvement Association. A colleague and friend of his, Ralph Abernathy, was also involved. They set up, their goal was to, I believe the book says, about 50%, keep about 50% or half of the African Americans from riding the bus, use economic pressure to get the policy changed. And it was way, way more positive than 50%. It was close to 90% or more. Then from the Montgomery bus boycott, this catapulted the civil rights movement into the future with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and we'll talk about some other organizations that sprang up. It wasn't just one organization, such as the NAACP moving forward, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You had different groups spring up with different agendas, different trying to reach different groups of people. I guess that would fall under agenda. And these organizations helped catapult the civil rights movement forward. In this section, we'll take us through the 60s. We'll come back and talk about the 60s and some other things with the 60s after this section. Now, Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court in 1950s passed that judicial action, saying separate but equal from Plessy versus Ferguson is no longer legitimate. And Supreme Court made that ruling, but it didn't change anything. Little Rock had to integrate their schools, but the Governor Faubus resisted. So as he resisted, he refused to integrate the National Guard. He brought out the National Guard, and under the auspices, under the illusion, with the premise that the idea that the National Guard is going to protect these children from bad things happening to them. The Little Rock Nine, and 9 African American students that were chosen to integrate into the school. And what people were seeing was that, the National Guard was being used against the children, the Little Rock Nine, not to help them. So President Dwight D. Eisenhower, nicknamed Ike, he sees the National Guard being used. Ike wasn't necessarily very progressive when it came to civil rights, but he didn't have a problem with civil rights, but he wasn't a huge advocate of civil rights. He saw the governor making his power play with the National Guard. He kind of looked at Governor Faubus and said, I will see your National Guard and raise you the 101st Airborne, which were the elite troops in World War II. He sent the 101st Airborne into Little Rock and later stripped Governor Faubus of Arkansas from having authority over the National Guard. So he sent in the troops to protect these 9 students. And as the old saying goes, a picture's worth 1,000 words. The images from this event that were being shown on newsreels, in magazines, in newspapers, on television. These images, people up north were seeing, and people in other areas of the country were seeing this go on, and they were, I don't want to say amazed, possibly incredulous, possibly just their mind was blown, I guess, to put it in easier terms, that they couldn't believe this behavior was going on, that they actually pulled the National Guard out to bully these 9 students, and the hatred that was being thrown at these 9 students. And these images, and you'll see this, with Emmett Till's funerals, mom having pictures of his beaten and decomposed body being published in magazines to show this is what's happening. People hear these things and think, okay, it's like, what's going on now? With the coronavirus, you have people saying everything's a hoax, this isn't a big deal, and coming up, I don't see anything going on, this can't be happening because I don't see it. Very concrete, very basic thinking. And these images go out, and these videos, film of these incidents go out, and people see this is actually happening. You don't have the technology to easily Photoshop things in back in the day. You don't have the technology to easily green screen yourself into settings. That technology didn't exist, so people are seeing these images and they're realizing this isn't fake, this is actually happening. And it really sways U.S. opinion, popular opinion towards the civil rights movement, because they can't believe this is happening. D covers. Moving on to section D. Hopefully I'm not making too loud of clicking noise. From the Montgomery bus boycott, and you have the concept of nonviolent protests. the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee comes up with this idea of sit-ins. They go into the South where African Americans were not allowed to eat, not allowed to be served. You have the segregation of water fountains, restrooms, restaurants, hotels, stores, all kinds of aspects of society that are segregated, not just the buses. And they go in and they sit down at a lunch counter peacefully, sit at tables in restaurants. And they sit there and they're refused service. They're ignored. They're asked to leave. They don't leave. They're polite. They just sit there. Some are thrown out. Some the police are called in to be escorted out. They refuse to leave. The police drag them out. And they don't fight back. Some are beaten. Some are, people spit at them, hurl racial epithets at them, call them nasty names. They don't fight back. And it's key for them not to fight back. And I can't even imagine, taking this abuse and not fighting back. But it's important. And they realize that if they fight back, that is what's going to be shown to the people. The edited scene of them fighting back. Remember, it's, the first person who usually causes trouble doesn't get in trouble. It's the person who retaliates. And they're very aware, very cognizant of that. So what they're going to do is they're going to take this abuse, and it's unimaginable to me to sit there and take that abuse. But they take that abuse, and once again, it's pushed out to the American public, and people see all of these 20-something teens into their 20s. These people are doing, and there's older African Americans participating too. What they're doing is they're just sitting there asking to, order food or a beverage. Like you go to the hot dog shop or you go to some of the other restaurants in town when you were allowed to go and requesting food. And they're being turned away, and some of them are getting beaten, some of them are getting arrested, they're getting physically thrown out. And all they're doing is wanting to do what everyone else does, and that's order food at a restaurant. Of what was going on, and it sways opinion. Then you have the Congress on Racial Equality come into play. And they instituted something called freedom rides. Many bus companies in many states had a policy where you cannot, interstate buses would not carry whites and African Americans, or they weren't allowed to sit together, they weren't allowed on the same bus. You had segregation in busing. With Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, CORE, what they proposed was people who were white, people who were African American, get on these buses and ride from the north, where it was more acceptable, into the south on these buses. And they get on the buses and they ride peacefully, which is violating laws in some parts of the country. At one point, the buses are stopped. The one bus is burned. It's a famous image if you search it, Freedom Rides. One of the first images that'll pop up is of this bus that's on fire. Protesters burned it, not the protesters that were protesting for integration on buses, but people who were fighting to keep the buses segregated, torched the bus. Reason being because you had whites and African Americans on that bus. And because there was travel in between states, that falls under federal guidelines. It was no longer a state issue, a local issue. Because it was between states, that falls under the Interstate Commerce Commission's authority, and Bobby Kennedy, who at the time was Attorney General under his brother John F. Kennedy, who was president. Bobby Kennedy, who was very active in civil rights, he brought the power of the federal government against this form of segregation, and they forced the integration of buses across state lines. All right, this segment of the video is called Things Mr. Sal Missed. And these are things I'm going to go back through, look at the online eText, and see what I didn't put in the Prezi. Actually, things that I thought I put in the Prezi that didn't save. So that's what this section will cover. One of the vocab terms that's in the flashcards I posted is James Blake. I'm going to try and write this without too many, the tapping you hear, the tapping and the rapping on my iPad is not a Raven, but it is the stylus. So James Blake, he was the bus driver that instigated this incident. Rosa Parks had run-ins with him before. She tried to avoid him, wasn't paying attention, ended up getting on his bus, and that led to the craziness that became Rosa getting arrested for not giving up her seat on the bus, brought about the Montgomery bus boycott, and really moved the civil rights movement forward. Another term, another person that I forgot to discuss, Mohandas Gandhi. These are in the flashcards. The flashcards are posted in Wakelet and Edmodo. I need you guys to start relying on Edmodo to get your resources, or the Wakelet. I'm not going to be pushing everything out through email. I'll send you the information and the links, but you're going to have to go to Edmodo and Wakelet to get the information. Mohandas Gandhi, he was an activist in India, helped get India its freedom from Great Britain. He pushed this civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance to combat social injustice, as it says in the book. It's very hard to do because you have people protesting peacefully in many instances, or some instances, however extreme you want to go. Bad things are happening to them. Your natural tendency is to lash out and fight back. They resisted that effort to fight back, and it's very hard to do. Okay, the stylus just died, so I have to flip it and use the other side of the stylus. Little Rock happens in 1957. So 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education, the schools still haven't been integrated, and they push for the integration. So the next thing we have, I told you about Governor Faubus. Give you his spelling on his full name. His name was Orville Faubus, and I think I'm saying that right. Faubus. Okay, he pushes the National Guard, mobilizes the National Guard, pushes to prevent students, the Little Rock Nine, from getting into the school. People see what's going on. They see it on television. They see all this hatred going on their TV screens. Eisenhower is not going to put up with the governor telling him what he can and cannot do. Sends in the 101st Airborne. And eventually, Congress in 1959, they passed the Civil Rights Act. And this is found in 54C towards the bottom. Civil Rights Act. It was set up as a permanent Civil Rights Commission and to work on African American rights to vote, things of that nature. Wasn't very effective, didn't have enforcement powers, but it's a first step. Not to say it's okay to pass ineffective legislation, but it gets the ball rolling, so to speak, and gets people acting, and gets people thinking about civil rights and moving civil rights forward. Talked about the sit-in movement. Talked about that, and that's where we're going to leave off right now with this section of what Mr. Sow missed. Okay. This is part 1 of the video. I'm just going to add the rest of the chapter on this video and re-upload it, but I wanted to get this up to you guys right now. Some of the things on what is to come are as follows. So 54E. deals with pains and gains. Talks about integration for colleges and universities. Talks about equality in schools. We mentioned Birmingham, Alabama. Okay, 1963, Birmingham, Alabama, the Children's March took place. You had civil rights leaders get students out of school, young African American students, and they marched peacefully in town, oftentimes singing church hymns, things like that, peaceful protest to fight segregation. They wanted to desegregate or integrate the businesses and life in Alabama. It was very segregated, very sectioned off, very unequal. So they had the students march. And what happened was, police chief, and his name is listed in there, there's also in the flashcards, Bull Connor, unleashed fire hoses, tear gas, police dogs on these children who were peacefully marching. And this was all captured on film, pushed out over television, pushed out in the newspapers, and in newscast clips. And people saw these children being attacked as they marched peacefully for equality. Once again, this goes back to the nonviolent protests. They're seeing violence from one side, and this was the authority side of government, lashing out, attacking children, and it helped push the civil rights movement forward, because in many places you had people saying, I can't believe this would happen. You know, there's no way that would happen. I know these people who are in authority, they would never do that, and that's true. But in some places it was happening. Birmingham was one of those cities. And they got to see these acts of violence. And it was very moving and pushed the momentum of the civil rights movement forward. 54F. Martin Luther King Jr. is discussed. I will give you the information on that. We jump to 54G, and that deals with the long, hot summers and the race riots that start taking place in the late 60s, early 70s. That happens across the United States. That also builds into, as we get later into the 60s, early 70s, builds into riots, anti-war protests, and we'll discuss that later. So you have all these protests going on in America. And then we get into 54H, Malcolm X. And I will tell you, I'll get that information out to you as to what I want you to focus on. We're just going to touch over just a little bit of this and go over it and cover it more when we get into the actual historical events of that time. And last but not least, 54I, and that's the concept of black power, and it continues with different ways that civil rights were being pushed from different perspectives, different aspects of society, some nonviolent, some violent, some controversial, some not controversial. So that's what the chapter ends up on. I'll push all this out into the Prezi, and I will tell you what to focus on as we move forward so you can better organize your notes. Take care, have a good one, and this will be posted for you both on the Wakelet and in Edmodo.